Hello. The Supreme Court just made a landmark decision ruling that the Trump administration's tariffs that had been in place since Liberation Day were actually illegal. Today, I'm going to be discussing not only my opinions and thoughts on this whole tariff ordeal, I'll also be discussing, well, what happens now? That seems to be the question we're all left with, as does the economic policy and direction of that completely shift? What happens with the money we actually collected from tariffs? Will the government be forced to give that back to the companies it actually got that money from? And of course, we'll be discussing kind of where this leaves companies now, how this will impact the companies operating inside the United States and those outside. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, for any of those who have kept up with financial journals or news sources during this whole entire tariff ordeal, this decision today may not have come as a surprise. That's because the executive branch, and this is confirmed by the Supreme Court ruling, does not actually have the tariff stick of power. This has been a thing that has resided inside of Congress's duties, and of course, the executive branch did not receive expressly written consent to actually make broad based tariffs a reality. Now, I do want to mention that this decision today was a majority decision. So, out of 9 voting members, six of them voted in favor of, well, making the tariffs from the executive branch illegal ending today. Now, it was actually 3 liberals and 3 conservatives. So, I don't want there to be a narrative of, oh, this was a strictly political thing. No, this was a bipartisan issue that many felt that the executive branch had overstepped its powers by actually enacting these tariffs in the first place. Even the executive branch felt a little bit as if they had overstepped their powers, as I'll be going into the policy and loophole they were kind of trying to pull to justify their broad based tariffs. Now, in this decision, the biggest question mark that kind of has arrived from all of this is what will actually happen to the revenues generated from the tariffs. Now, I thought it was important to mention that not only the New York City Fed, the National Bureau of Economics, and the Kiefel Institute of World Economy, located in Germany, all put out their own studies, and these have all been cited in numerous news publications that the tariffs, spoiler alert, were 90% or so in that ballpark floated by American citizens and American firms. So, while we talk about tariffs may be coming back and some of that money may be given back, I don't want to get anyone's hopes up that it'll be going back to individuals, even though some of it arguably should. I just would not be super optimistic on you personally or I myself receiving any of that money. If the money is going to come back, it's going to come back in the form of the numerous companies lining up for lawsuits against the federal government. Now, as I mentioned, the tariffs were first put in place via kind of a, well, loophole that the executive branch hoped would allow them to bypass all of the necessary Congress support for broad based tariffs. And that is, of course, their utilization of the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, which was supposed to give some power to the executive branch where it could make similar decisions. The problem is that the wording in this act didn't necessarily give a good description as to what a global emergency or what an emergency that the president could act on is. And so using that to say that a, for instance, trade deficit with other countries was a national emergency didn't really fly with the Supreme Court. And I'd say didn't really fly with the general population when the polling came out on Liberation Day. In fact, the instant that Liberation Day happened, I remember where I was. I discussed Liberation Day in a previous YouTube video, but I was actually watching a guest speaker event when we saw the big board of tariffs come out, and I just watched the stock market plummet in its reaction. It was such a bad throwback to the government that they immediately started trying to pivot and change some of their tariffs via the whole entire ordeal of negotiating deals and whatnot. Now, me personally, if any of you have seen any of my previous videos where I've covered this or cannot tell, I personally was not a fan of the Liberation Day tariffs and the broad based tariffs on companies, especially not for the reasons provided. Yes, the fentanyl crisis is terrible. But what's weird is that we didn't even target the countries responsible for that with broad based tariffs, which is kind of why this argument went out the window. And then trade deficits in a system where we're a service based economy, and there was a lot of, I'd say, mixed opinions on how the actual math in this calculation was done and which factors were included and which weren't, doesn't constitute a national emergency, especially when you seek to criticize a system that has put the United States as the wealthiest country from the system. It seemed a little bit interesting. But this wasn't really a policy that came out of the blue. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. But for those who paid attention to the run up to the actual election, this was a set of policies that was, well, publicly displayed and was talked about numerous times. I was someone who I did when both presidential candidates made podcast interviews. I watched them, and this was something that, if you go back to the Joe Rogan episode that Donald Trump was on, he was proudly talking about the 1930s with like rose tinted glasses. And for me, this was really interesting because he was talking about Smoot Hawley, right? Smoot Hawley is a policy that most economists agree worsened the Great Depression. Like, it's kind of a general consensus. And that may not necessarily mean a lot to you as a viewer. But to me, if this really stood out because economists love to not agree on anything. It's like they get personal pleasure from sticking to their school of thought, criticizing everyone else, and then coming up with nuances in another person's opinion to be like, but actually, I'm right. Like, they can be at times very self centered and want to stand out as the one true camp of truth tellers or whatever. They want to be right above all else. But this was a policy that pretty much there was a consensus on amongst this crowd of people, right? Whose whole thing is not agreeing on anything. And Smoot Hawley is pretty common. It's almost impossible to have any class on economics where Smoot Hawley is not brought up. And typically it's brought up with, and it was a terrible policy. And it's an example of what can happen wrong with tariffs. Now, some people, I think, have kind of taken the wrong approach out of this and gotten the tariffs are horrible and there's no use case for them, and I'd actually disagree. And even the administration tried to make a argument that their tariffs were comparable to when Ronald Reagan did tariffs. It's just the difference was Ronald Reagan specifically tariffed one set of goods, that being Japanese vehicles, and it kind of helped save the American market for cars because at that time Japan was making on par with quality wise American vehicles, but at significantly cheaper costs because their labor cost a lot less. And it kind of helped save the American car industry. Whereas broad based tariffs just do a lot of damage, as I've already discussed, with the consumers actually taking the brunt force of that. Again, the three sources I mentioned, the three studies argue between 90% on some of them to upwards of 96% being fronted by American firms and American consumers. Now, as of the writing of this video, markets have actually responded quite positively. We've seen all the major indexes be up. Again, there is still time in the day when I'm recording this, so there is potential for new stuff to come out and change that. But so far, all the major indices are up in the US, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, and the VIX index, which is pretty much a sentiment index, is down, which is good. It goes up in times of fear and when bad news comes out, and down when people feel better about things. So overall, the sentiment is pretty good. There are some lingering questions, though, as I briefly touched on earlier. Those, of course, being what happens with this close to $115 billion in revenue the government has generated from whatever source, and where does this leave companies now? Now there's some more uncertainty as to what the economic policy was. Even with the horrible tariffs in place, there was still some certainty as to, okay, this was the landscape. Now companies are going to have to throw out their assumptions. They're going to have to figure out, okay, where does this leave us now? And there are some questions in that. Overall, though, we're seeing a lot of major companies that kind of were jump starting this whole process by suing the federal government to try and get returns from the tariff revenue. But that list is actually just dramatically increasing. And it's likely to continue to increase into today, probably sometime into the future, until we at least have some clarity as to what's happening with the revenue. Again, as much as I wish the money would come back to individual consumers as well, I just don't know the likelihood of that. But that being said, there's a lot of uncertainty now yet again, but honestly, I am hopefully optimistic. For any of you who have hopped on an earnings call in the past year, it's been almost impossible to avoid a mention of tariffs and what's that doing to the bottom line of these companies. And we're seeing a lot of the companies that were publicly saying that they were being hurt by tariffs and being punished by it and their stock price depreciating are now seeing a bit of a boost today with the Supreme Court decision. So overall, there is still some murkiness as to what's actually going to happen. I assume that now that it's been ruled that this never should have been a thing, this wasn't a power to the executive branch like numerous people were saying beforehand, that we might see some form of money go back. I'm not sure it'll be the full 115 billion. I think that they'll try and make it as hard as possible for the companies to actually receive that money back, but I figure they'll have to pay back something. I have a hard time imagining they're going to be really efficient in this process. Now, I do think a lot of the companies that were hit with tariffs that, again, depreciated in stock value are now going to be rewarded. Especially, I'd be looking, if you're looking to actually invest off of this landmark decision, I'd be looking for companies that have been doing great, had a great track record, but, oh, they mentioned tariffs in an earnings call and it's kind of spiraled them downwards. I have quite a few positions like that in my own portfolio, and I was able to strengthen those positions based on this policy change. Overall, I just wanted to hop on a second and kind of discuss this new breaking news that we're seeing. It's kind of interesting to see this come to a close after a little bit, yes, less than a year. And in a way, I do feel like this was a thing that was always going to happen because it was just strictly not in the powers of the executive branch. And even at the time when they tried claiming this loophole on the 1977 Act, this obviously didn't fit into a national emergency. It just kind of feels a little bit like a no-dur moment, I'm going to be honest. I've had quite a few arguments with people as to whether or not Smoot-Hawley was actually a good economic policy. It takes one Google search and there is like a overwhelming sentiment of, no, it was terrible. And again, it threw me for a loop that an administration was able to publicly parade running with early 1930s economic policy and agenda, and people voted for that. I mean, obviously, I don't think a lot of people actually spend the proper time they should. They pretty much go vote based on party and based on who looked better on TV. But these are things that should have been avoided in the first place, and I feel quite okay saying that. So overall, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for checking out my video. I really appreciate your time, and again, I'm just thankful that I get to be in a position where I can just come on and yap about my opinions. So thank you.